twice a year, the Norwood City School and all school districts in the state of Ohio have to prepare a 5-year forecast. It's in November and May. This is the update forecast for May. There are 3 things that I want you to take away from this discussion. We're spending more than we bring in every year the forecast after this year. A substitute levy is planned for November of 2020 to replace the expiring emergency levy at the same revenue amount. And there are a lot of unknowns regarding the revenue in this forecast. But one thing we do know is that we are still a little overstaffed, and that is, we are going to work on that through our hiring freeze. I'm going to review the forecast as usual, explaining the most important revenues and expenditures, and then I will address the elephant in the room, pending state funding cuts and how it affects our bottom line. Remember, the forecast just estimates the general fund. All other funds are considered self-sufficient or should become self-sufficient. At any time during this presentation, if you have a question, please interrupt me. It's much easier to deal with questions at the time that they come up.
It's zoomed in, so they can't see it at all.
Yeah, I'm looking at it too. It looks good.
Okay.
Good.
This
Okay,
is what they
good.
see.
All right.
Thank you, NCT.
Yes. So this first slide compares our November forecast to our May forecast, and this is important just to show continuation. There's not a lot of changes in the forecast, even though when you think about it, we've had some huge changes come up in the 5-month period of time. So the very first part is property tax. The red line is what I thought we would get in November, and the blue line is what we actually received, because we have received our final settlement for property taxes. So as I said before, real estate tax revenues are higher than expected in November. I had expected a refund to a commercial taxpayer. That didn't happen. Unrestricted grants, that's our state revenue, has decreased by more than 5% compared to last year, in the most part due to state funding cuts. All other revenues are just slightly higher than expected in the prior forecast. That's that bottom line, the bottom red and the blue bar. Sources of revenue, I always feel like this pie chart is just a really helpful chart to review every year. Every time I do a forecast, I bring it up, and it just explains the sources of our revenue. So you'll see the dark blue half of the pie, 51%, is real estate tax revenue. That is our major supporter of this school district, is tax revenue. The next one is unrestricted aid, which is our state funding, unrestricted state funding at 23%.
So I just want to make sure that when people see this chart, so the $412,000 that the district was just cut
Yes,
comes directly out of the 23% number.
that's correct.
So what that does is that makes the other sections of the pie chart more heavily weighted, because it's not the pie, the whole entire pie is shrinking.
Yes.
Which means that the other parts aren't growing.
Yes.
The other parts are just becoming more important to us because the unrestricted aid is shrinking.
That's correct.
If you could, I know all other revenue is our 3rd largest category there. Can you just give a little bit of an explanation of what
Sure.
includes all other revenue?
Sure, and we'll talk about that slide because it is a big portion, that 14%. We'll talk about that in depth a little bit later, but the greatest majority of our all other revenue expenditure or revenue line is TIF revenue.
Right.
And that is for our abated commercial property owners that have special agreements to pay revenue directly to the city, or to the school
To the
district.
school district.
Does this include
this
like
is where
Brookwood?
Yes,
abatement and TIFs, where we've negotiated to make sure that the school district is made whole.
yes,
That revenue doesn't come through the property tax.
correct.
It comes through a separate agreement where the property pays us directly.
It comes directly to us rather than through the county auditor, that's correct.
No, grant monies would also fall under all revenue?
No, actually,
Or where does
grants
grant
are
go?
not allowed to be in the general fund, so they're in a different fund entirely.
Okay.
And so that's why at the beginning, that's a good point to bring up, but when I say all other funds should be considered self-sufficient or should become self-sufficient, that's one of the ones I'm talking about, is our federal grants and our state grants. any of those grants that cannot support themselves need to be trimmed so that the general fund doesn't have to transfer money there. So. Okay, so this is real estate tax revenues. This bar graph just shows the history of what we received in real estate tax revenue. This is residential and commercial together. And you'll see some pretty high variances there. And that is due to one-time payments, settlements, and refunds. Because we do have a significant commercial tax base, you do see more often a settlement and refunds and repayments because we are taking our valuations for these commercial properties. We're getting appraisals on them. We're trying to keep those values high to protect our residential tax base from paying higher taxes than they
Correct.
should be.
And so there's a slightly lighter color blue on those bar charts
Yes.
for the other years.
Yes, the lighter blue to the right is estimated, and then like that aqua color at the top is our emergency levy that's expiring. So because the substitute levy that's going to replace that has not been voted by or approved yet by our taxpayers, I'm not allowed to put it in the forecast, but as potential revenue, so that you'll see that's why that's highlighted. And on the forecast itself, on the front page of the forecast, you'll see that 1.7 million at the bottom, where I'm estimating that we hope that that'll be coming in to our coffers in the next couple of years as a replacement of the revenue that's expiring, but it's not been voted on yet.
Right, so without the substitute levy, I mean, if you're looking at
I'm
years,
gonna wipe this for just a minute because our viewers at home can't see this.
yeah,
So this section here in the light blue is if we maintain the levy, we'll stay on target with our budgeting for where we are. If we don't pass that to maintain, it will drop to here. So we'll go from
more than 14 million
14 million
to
down
less than
to
12.
less than 12 million.
Yeah,
Right.
So those numbers are a little hard to read at home, but that's a couple $1 million drop right there.
Yes,
yeah.
it is.
Stay off to the side, clean the banana something.
It's a $3.5 million drop altogether.
Right,
Some of it's going to show up in real estate revenues, some of it's going to show up in tangible revenues, and some of it shows up in homestead and rollback, but altogether it's 3.5 million.
3.5 between here and
a
here.
total, if you add up the total for all three of those
Sources.
aqua color boxes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and our substitute levy will be a permanent levy. That's about the only change between the emergency levy and the substitute levy, is that instead of it lasting for 10 years, it'll be permanent.
Yeah. Now, do you mind me asking, I know we're talking about real estate tax revenue, but can you just kind of, I know you had mentioned earlier that we're spending more than what we're bringing in right now. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit more on that?
The major reason for us to need this substitute levy, and the reason that we're spending more than we're bringing in, is because of the loss of tangible personal property tax allocations. And let me just move to that slide. So tax allocation reductions. Tangible personal property tax used to be a tax on equipment and inventory that businesses would pay. And that tax has gone away. Years and years ago, it was removed by legislation. And the state has been giving us allocations since that time. In this graph, you'll see that in fiscal year 13, we received $2,240,000 approximately. And then they started cutting those allocations from the state. And so then it would drop amount, and then it would drop some more. So as of this year, we're receiving $150,000. Next year, $100,000, and the following year, we'll be at $50,000. And then tangible personal property tax will be completely gone, when we used to receive $2,240,000 every single year from the state as a direct revenue source, because they did away with the tax revenue. So because of this, we have to have this emergency levy substituted so that it would become a steady revenue source for us to make up for this tax and allocation the state cut.
So this shows a 10-year gap between 2013, when they started doing the cuts, as it went down. This is fiscal year '23. After that, it's zero.
Yep.
We don't get it again. But we're currently here. We have received the funds for 2020.
Yes,
So this was at what number?
100,000.
100,000. So then we'll go to 50.
And then the last one's 50, and then that last one, that's represents zero right there.
Okay.
So if the levy is passed, how much of that would that make up for? So we're getting 150,000 this year, would the levy, cover more than that though?
No, the
Would it be
levy.
this level, or what level would that
Would
put
it
us
take
at?
us back up to
No,
fiscal
so,
year 18, or where would it be comparable?
so that money's gonna be gone.
Right.
And we won't see that funding anymore. But remember, the substitute levy is the same amount of money that we're already getting in an emergency tax levy. So it's not that we're asking for our taxpayers to give us more to make up for what the cuts have come from the state. We're asking the taxpayers to pay the same amount. We were calling it emergency levy, now we're calling it a substitute levy, but it is the same amount of money. So it is not making up for a loss as much as it is, please keep your part stable so that we can deal with the state's cuts. Does that make sense, the way I said it?
won't
So
be
this is
getting
gonna exist no
any
matter
more.
what, like this
That's
just is no matter what.
That's right.
Right, every school
We
district,
lost this money.
yeah, every school district in the state that has seen some sort of revenue from tangible personal property is having that eliminated,
Yes.
right? So the state's taking those tax revenue dollars and they're putting them into other buckets. It's not gonna be this bucket for the schools, we're just losing this completely.
Right.
And because of this makes the other revenue sources that much more important to us. Incredibly important to us. And so the substitute levy is not going to generate any new dollars. We're just trying to figure out a way to stay afloat and then be responsible by trimming our budget as much as we can in order to keep ourselves fiscally sustainable.
Right.
That's the way that I see this.
Right. In a world of crazy variances on the state revenue side, we need our local taxes to stay stable, and that's what we're asking for in this substitute levy in November. Keep our taxes stable, same amount. Are there any more questions on the tax allocations? All right, I'm going to go back and see, we talked about real estate, state revenue. So this is a part of state revenue that's called state foundation. There are two major sources of state revenue that we receive now. One, state revenue foundation. The other one is our state tax allocations, of which we were talking about TPP allocations. So this is the foundation revenue where we're actually paid on a per student basis. And in the darker blue bars, you'll see some variances. That's our actual history of what we receive from the state. And then the first lighter blue bar is 2020. That's this year. And you'll see that drop where we've received 5% less than the year before. And then you'll see each year from there out, for 2 years, I'm predicting another 4% cut each year. Until finally you see this large jump, which is, Mary and I were kind of laughing about it, saying that we'll be thankful to get back up to this amount. But you have to realize in 2023, I'm predicting that we'll still have less than in fiscal year 19, which is last year. And what happens in those 5 years of inflationary costs, our costs are going to continue to go up. For heaven's sakes, we're air conditioning the entire district for our students' comfort. And lots of other things will be happening that will cost us more money. But in that 5-year period of time from the state, we'll be happy to get back to prior year funding levels.
So
And
Julie,
I-
you said you're estimating 4%, but when do we know? Like, when will the governor tell you?
Right, and he just told us last week that he was cutting this year. We've not heard when will they cut next year. We don't know the amount yet. I don't know what percentage we'll lose next year. We have been told we probably will see cuts. He would like to look at May's revenues, so we have to get all the way through May, take a week for them to process those revenues and do their paperwork, and then they'll review it. So I would think by the end of June, mid to end of June, we should hear something from the state indicating what our cut will be next year.
Do you think that cut will be compounded with the cut they just did? Or will
Yes.
they base it on the original amount? So
No, I think it'll be compounded. I think when we receive a cut, I think they're going to say, this year, your cut's going to be this amount. And then the next year, they're going to say, this year, your cut is going to be this amount. So it'll be three separate reductions in
You
state
have
funding.
to also remember that the state is under some restrictions, that they can't cut educational funding more than a certain percentage
Correct.
at a time. And I think it's based off of like a 3-year average.
That's correct.
Of funding. So the fact that they made the first cut for fiscal year 20 and took it out in the last 6 weeks, what that does is that drops the 3-year average, so they can make a bigger cut next year.
So that explains then why 2023 goes back up.
Well, I mean, 2023 is kind
That's
of
just
what.
an estimate.
That's just an estimate
Just an
of when the state will say, we're going to bring everybody back up.
Right.
We've gone through the whole COVID crisis and, we've shored up, where the state's been hurting in other places.
Right.
And we're going to give that money back. But what frustrates me about this graph is the fact that it's not bringing us whole when you count inflationary funding.
Right.
Right? I mean, because things aren't going to get cheaper. Health insurance is going to get more expensive. Salaries are going to continue to increase.
Right.
Your utilities are going to continue to increase. None of that's going to get cheaper.
Right. Right. That's exactly right. And you can see from our history too, that's why I like having history in here. From the history, we had 2 years that were up a little bit and otherwise it's just stagnant. So it's not like we were funded properly and then we needed to make a 4% cut. It's always been, for years, it's just been flat funded.
Yeah.
For no-
Also keep in mind that the school district is on what's called a guarantee. So we're funded at a certain number of students, regardless of whether we're at that number or not.
Right.
So if, let's say, we were to gain another 100 students into the district,
it'd still fall under the guarantee.
we wouldn't get another dime from the
Right.
state. So,
But we'd have 100 new students to
To-
find classrooms for, to find teachers for, and
correct.
resources for, and lunch for.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
But,
exactly
I
right.
mean, honestly, to me, I'd rather the 100 kids.
I
Right?
would too. I just want to make sure we've got the resources to
Right.
service them appropriately.
And thankfully, the Board of Education has always been very conservative, and we spend our money wisely, and we do have a 120-day cash balance, which I'm very happy to say that, we have a slight cushion to help us with some of these issues, but it's a slight cushion. It's not going to get us through 3 years of state cuts, that's for certain. One other thing I need to say on this slide is state revenue in this forecast is estimated using current law with estimated applied percentage reductions. If the reductions are deeper than estimated, it could cause a material variance, at which time I'd need to restate the forecast. We already talked about TPP. This source is the last source of revenue. It's called other revenues, and the largest payment that comes in here is payment in lieu of taxes, or TIF revenue is what we call it. In fiscal year 19, the district received $1,713,000 in TIF payments from area business taxpayers. After challenging the values of some of those properties, we expect $2,808,000 in annual TIF revenue for fiscal year 20. It's important to note in fiscal year 20, you'll see that large jump in that light blue bar. That's this year. It's important to note that $587,000 of that bar of this year's revenue was due last year, but did not come this year. You will see that late payment is not continued in future years because of course I wouldn't do that. It should have been here last year, so I'm not going to continue it at that high amount. It looks like maybe we received cuts there also. It's not a cut, it's just timing.
So basically, about this much of it should have been paid here, which would have leveled this out.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you'd see that's stable also. There's not a lot of growth there either. Is there any questions on other revenue?
So a lot of this is really tied to economic development
Yes.
within the city. So as future economic development happens, it will greatly impact this portion of our revenue stream.
That's right.
Okay.
And I do not, I estimate the revenues for what our current abatements and TIFs are,
Right.
but I don't have any idea what future ones would be, so of course they're not in there. We would have to restate that as the forecast, at the time period, the forecast
Okay.
of that forecast. Moving on to expenditures. This is the comparison of November's forecast to May for just expenditures. The first one is personnel services. You'll see the dark blue line went down just a little bit as we, payroll and benefits both decreased as we don't replace open positions as people leave us. Purchase services dropped due to the pandemic closure of school. It's not as expensive to heat and cool. Yes, and purchase services, our utilities went down. Our transportation went down a little bit. Of course, we don't need any teacher subs. That went down. Supplies went up a little bit as we needed additional STEM supplies for our new STEM program and some additional technology needs. Software is included as a supply. Capital outlay increased a little bit as we spend the transferred money from our abandoned students' accounts for the high school sign. So overall, in expenditures, we're seeing some savings compared to the November forecast. Another pie graph, this is the breakdown of our expenditures. So the dark blue, a little more than half of our pie is salaries. We are a service-oriented business. So of course, our most expensive line items are going to be personnel and benefits to pay for our teachers and the rest of our staff. Together with salaries and benefits, that's 74% of our budget. Purchase services come in at 21%. Capital outlay has a very small imprint on the general fund and forecast due to the fact that we have a permanent improvement levy that covers all of our technology needs and taking care of our buildings.
So it's been my experience on that for a service-oriented business that if your personnel costs are at let's say a 70% level, that should mean that you're financially, fiscally sustainable.
Yes.
If it gets to 80% or above, I mean, that's where you really struggle to maintain yourself.
I agree.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I agree with that. In addition, when you think about it, we're a small district, so some of our purchase services would be considered
Personnel.
payroll and benefits and personnel if we were in a larger district. So, yes, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. And then purchase services also includes what we spend for special needs.
Yes. Trying to think what my numbers are. 25% of purchase services is special education contracted costs for students who are actually too handicapped to be in our buildings. And those costs, the services that we provide to those children are required by an IEP that's mandated by the state. And then another 20% of purchase services is our school choice, also mandated by the state. So 45% of that category is mandated by the state.
Okay.
Personnel services, again, the dark blue line is actual, the light blue lines are estimated. You'll see that second light blue line in 2021. That's where you'll see the savings from our layoffs and our hiring freeze in '21. I will say that I do not have any additional reductions to staffing in the forecast. So any future resignations or retirements that we see will be additional savings over and above what the forecast states.
Okay.
Benefits, fringe benefits make up 18% of the district's total budget. We saw a 10% increase in health insurance premiums last year, a 2.2% increase this year, and expect a 4% next year. After that, I expect 10% because somebody has to pay for COVID. All of our employees currently pay at least 20% of premiums for their health insurance. And you'll also notice that in 2021, you'll see the effects of staff reductions on the benefits side. This is what we were just talking about. Purchase services make up 21% of the budget. 25% is used for special education contracted costs, and 20% is for school choice. A smaller amount of this budget includes transportation, cleaning services, and utilities, all of which are well controlled, and we work really hard to manage those costs. So this slide is on the state funding reductions, and again, you'll see in the dark blue line, that is our actual state revenue, unrestricted state revenue for the past several years. And then the light blue bars show what I thought we would see in state reductions. Again, this is my estimate. This year's been projected by the governor, but the next 2 years have not. And so then in the numbers graph underneath that, you'll see that this year, 2020, a 6.8% decline, which is the 4.12 that the governor announced, plus we saw some reduction in a few other costs, a few other revenue sources like preschool funding and transportation funding. So altogether, that's 6.8% down this year, and I projected 4.7 the next 2 years. Then on this next slide, you'll see the results. What does that do to our bottom line? If we reduce this year by the 6%, next year by 4.7 and the 4.7. So you'll see, if you go down to the revenue surplus or deficit line, that we're positive this year. It's the one above that, not the dark one, but 2 above that. Yep,
These two,
yeah. That one, it starts off with the black 479, and then it goes to the red 569. That means next year we'll be spending into our carryover by 569,000. And the following year, we'll be spending into our carryover by 557,000. And that includes our substitute levy. So if the substitute levy by some chance would not pass, then underneath the black line is where we would be, which would be spending into our carryover 2.3 million the year after next.
So with this graph where we're looking at our bottom line, so keep in mind, we changed our policy to the administration that when we drop to a level, a cash balance level that's equivalent to 3 months worth of expenditures, that we ask the administration to come to us with a plan to keep ourselves afloat. So, and I'm going to be honest with you, we hit that number in fiscal year 21. And that's with the substitute levy. So anything below that, I mean, we really have to look long and hard at our expenditures.
Yes. We'll definitely be watching the bottom line on those years. You know, I feel like the next one I'm going to talk about is a 10% cut in state funding. And we'll talk about that in more depth, but while we're on this 4.7% slide, I want to talk about that. I would advise the board, it's my opinion, that we should just move forward with the hiring freeze for now. That's why it's on the agenda. That's what I want to see happen. That we'll see how many how much we can save over the next year. We'll see what the governor announces in budget cuts. But if the budget cut does come back from the state to lose 10% of our state funding, we're gonna have to make some harder choices. We just can't get through that kind of a revenue reduction.
Right, and so since we're talking about that line of fiscal thinking, so the longer that we wait to really discuss those harder choices, because we don't know what's going to happen. We have no idea, we don't have a crystal ball. But if the state comes back with a heavier cut moving down the line, and that really puts an impact on these bottom line numbers, the longer that we wait, the more money it costs us. Right, so if you rip the Band-Aid off sooner rather than later, you kind of save yourself at the end of the road, right? It's less of a hole that you have to dig yourself out of.
Right.
But if you wait to make those hard decisions, and nobody knows what's going to happen, the deeper the hole. Like if we don't do anything and they cut 10%, I mean, look at those numbers.
Right. So if we do see a 10% cut in fiscal year '21, we'll be spending $914,000 more than we bring in 2022, 1.3. I can't read from there.
Which one?
1.207, is that what it says?
Fiscal year 21,
Fiscal year 21,
Yeah.
at which line, I'm sorry?
The next one, fiscal year '22.
22.
20 is 914. It's 1.207, I think.
Yeah, 1,207,246.
Yeah, so over that 2-year period of time, we're losing 2.2 million of our cash reserves. And that does put us within, lower than our 90-day cash reserve policy.
yeah.
So like I said at the beginning of the forecast presentation, there are a lot of unknowns in this forecast. And we're gonna roll with punches. We're gonna wait and see what the governor says the end of June. And then, we're gonna see how much we can save over the next year. But we'll be talking again. I may have to revise the forecast.
I hope they don't get the 10%, that's gonna devastate a lot of districts.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
So, and I just want to share this with the board, and I want to remind my fellow colleagues that the last 2 years that Julie's done the forecast, I mean, she's been within 0.5% of estimated versus actual. I mean, it's almost like she has a crystal ball. So, putting these numbers up here, I mean, I have a lot of faith in what she's putting in this presentation for us to kind of expect, because, past performance predicts future behavior. And, if your forecasting has been as accurate the last 2 years, as accurate now, I mean, we really have some really difficult decisions to make moving
Right.
forward.
We do. And I work really hard on the forecast. I mean, all treasurers do. And I'm telling you what I don't know. I don't know what the state's gonna say. So, we're just gonna keep it in mind and move forward.